Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
What an evening, huh? You know, one of the reasons that one of the functions of moving as one, which is what we do when we are engaged in practice, we all do the same thing at the same time, is to affirm that we all have our place. We have a place. We have a place together in this world, in this life. And if we haven't come to this place and moment assured of that, that's one of the gifts, one of the treasures, to discover that yes, we each have a place. We each have our place here. And so moving as one in the Zendo with the Sangha is an enactment of an existential truth. So this is by way of introduction to my talk tonight, which is on self-respect and the two truths. We live in a culture of disrespect. When I was a child, that was not so much the case, but any of you who have spanned some decades are aware of how this has become increasingly so in our collective life, the disrespect. And so it's up to each of us to really embrace self-respect. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up. We talk to ourselves a lot and to each other with a lot of, in the collective level, a lot of cynical talk, a lot of discouraging talk. We don't talk necessarily to elders with respect, if we even acknowledge them in the passing during our days. We certainly don't regard our public figures with much respect. We don't assume that they deserve it. We don't see it necessarily being earned. Excuse me. So we're surrounded by foul language, insolent language, critical language, and overwhelmed by a plethora of narratives that fixate on what is not going well and how we fall short and what's wrong. And this infuses our minds and our hearts and can undermine and reinforce our ways of relating to ourselves. So it demonstrates the identity of the individual self and the collective self that we all share. We can't live in this world without being affected by it in how we feel about ourselves and how we reflect on ourselves. When we think about our practice, what our practice can offer the world, this is one way that working on our own self-respect can contribute to the world, to bring it forth in the marketplace where we work and where we carry on in the public sphere. I think about this when I walk. You know, I took a really long walk today, and somebody who has a birthday today was following on the path. And I was just aware of how sometimes you pass somebody on the path, whatever path you happen to be walking, and there's a real feeling of meeting and respect, mutual respect. And sometimes there's not even acknowledging that you exist. And sometimes there's a feeling that's thrown your way, which you have nothing to do with, but you certainly feel it. Right? So the way of the Bodhisattva, which is our way, takes up this as a central concern. Our precepts show us the way to use our body, speech, and mind. Our precepts, which we will begin a study of again in the month of June, and it will run through the summer on Tuesday nights. Precepts help us become aware of how, when we are careful with all of the ways that we affect others, we become aware of our effects. We become aware of what we're putting out and where it starts up in us. Now, self-respect is something that requires us to be clear about who we are, essentially. Underneath all the mistakes we've made and the regrets we have and the uncertainties and insecurities, coming to know who we are essentially is absolutely the work of the Dharma, of a Dharma life. And we can see how this awareness fashions what is important, what are the essential values that we're living and we're practicing living into, with self-compassion, with kindness and understanding and determination and patience. We learn this for ourselves first. Giving ourselves time to be aware of when we're being harsh towards ourselves and self-critical. We can't treat others kindly unless we have in our own bodies a sense of when we're being kind and when we're not. We need to know this in our own bodies. And unless we know the territory of self-respect, we cannot cultivate it towards all living beings, which is our vow. And self-respect. So I suggest that we take a minute now to measure your self-respect quotient. 1 to 10, on a scale of 1 to 10. Does it vary day to day? Does it vary during the day? Or is it rarely available? Or is it a constant? What leads you to respect yourself? And what makes you disrespect yourself? Do you bring the same sense of respect to all and everything that makes up your life? The big things and the little things. Mostly what makes up our life is the little things. Are you respectful of all the little things in a day? Do you attend with care and presence? And in what ways do you lapse in this regard and override the voice of your best self? How do you override? What causes you to override your best self? It's really important to see that and to meet that moment with a lot of compassion and the wisdom of clarity. Oh, this time when I was feeling really hurried. This time when I was feeling really sad. Whatever it is that you notice. And another part of self-respect and respect is boundaries. Well-defined boundaries allow us to show up more authentically and act with honesty. So one of the 5 remembrances that we chant sometimes is, your deeds are your closest companion. You are the beneficiary of your deeds. This really pertains to this sense of respecting yourself when you are acting in accordance with the right way, a way that is respectful. Then you are grounded in this sense. So why is it important? Why am I bringing this up in relation to our Buddhist practice, which emphasizes no self? This can be a real confusion. Why is self-esteem essential when self is empty? When we are empty of self-nature. Anybody ever wondered that? So I remember Aiken Roshi saying, when somebody asked him this question, why does it matter whether we have good self-esteem if we want to be Buddha, which is about no self? And his answer was, don't you think that Shakyamuni Buddha had a very strong sense of self-respect to follow the path that he did, where he questioned everything? You know, and I just remember when I heard him say that, my response was, right, yeah. It was very helpful to realize that, yes. In order to question things, really question them with an open, wide, penetrating question. We have to, not a cynical question or a rebellious kind of a thing, but really honoring our own questions. So we approach this quandary and are offered for it the two truths. Understanding them together, they help us bring balance and self-respect forward as we experience our life. And the two truths are the relative and the absolute. We're always talking about the relative truth and the absolute truth. So the relative truth is the conventional sense of the world. I'm in here, and you're out there. The world's out there. Me and the world are separate. That's certainly the way it seems, right? It seems a lot of the time. Everything in its particularities, everything is in its particular form. Investigating the relative truth, we journey among all the particulars of our lives, the infinite details that make up our experience. Body sensations, thoughts, beliefs, memories, habits, the material world, things, traffic, weather, our possessions, our family, our friends, all of these are particular. One is not like another. We notice change. We say that the weather changes, but we don't usually notice that the rock in the back of the house changes, although they do, but according to a different time frame. You know, where did all the soil in the world come from? Well, part of it is the rock, the mineral world, as it breaks down in wind and temperature over time. So we also notice time passing. We notice the seasons, conditions changing accordingly. Tonight, we're now in the season of outside kinhin, and somebody was cooking onions and bacon and who knows what else. So our bodies respond, right, with delight. Our bodies respond to heat and cold. We sweat, we shiver. We like heat. We don't like too much heat. We want it to cool off, but we don't want the clouds. So outer conditions and the conditions of our minds and hearts change according to everything around us. This is the ecology of the relative truth, right? The ecology of our lives, how everything works together in its own particular way. Someone asked during the sharing circle, but what about the absolute truth? Zen has a way to shed light on this. Zen practice does. But not in the usual way, and not according to words and concepts. The old masters are always pointing the way to the absolute truth. So someone asked Yunmen, what is the eye of the genuine teaching? And he answered, the steam of rice gruel, the steam of the oatmeal. We've recently been talking about opening the Dharma eye or opening the Dharma ear, and becoming aware of what the essential teaching is about the Dharma and about phenomena. We can say the steam of rice gruel or the sound of the toilet flushing. Any moment, any momentary action, activity, impression. During a Dharma talk, when Yunmen was explicating this point, a laywoman asked him to clarify it even more. She said, how about the place of non-thinking? So when we're talking about the absolute, we're really referring to something where thoughts and words and concepts don't help us. And the Master replied, cognition can hardly fathom it. Because cognition and thought is dependent on the separation of one thing from another. It emerges in the relative environment. So what does this tell us? No matter how many ways we describe the absolute, we cannot come close to the nature of the absolute. It is not for the thinking mind to understand. Just shut up, pay attention. When you're reading some of the accounts of old masters' meetings with students, they often hit the student, right? Well, we wouldn't do that now, but it seemed to happen a lot in the old days. And what that was about was feel it. This, right? Pay attention. Realize the meaning of any moment for yourself. We call it meaning, so we want to put something more into it. Recognize the absolute in the unknowing mind, the mind that does not know and doesn't need to know. Just the question is tapping. The question taps into, coming forth from what we call the absolute. It's a word, not a thing. The absolute is not a thing. It's not a place. It's not a quality. It has no words rescue it from its unformedness. So you know that you're deeply practicing when you're being true to the Buddha way as you ponder the meaning of the absolute in the midst of your swirl of conditioned experience. It's the pondering, the questioning. Where else, except maybe in a science lab, are we prompted to just question? Look into it. Don't go according to your habitual, conventional thinking pathways. So the Buddha taught a specific method for finding our way to respect the nature of self. Because that's really what it's about. Living according to the Dharma way is respecting the true nature of this life. And he called this identity view, the relative view. What do you identify with as self? I am this. What are you referring to? What do you refer to when you say, I am this? Well, there are the aggregates, the body, thought, sensation, feelings, consciousness. The Buddha taught that we appropriate the aggregates as self. He talked about appropriation and identification. We appropriate the aggregates. When we think something is us, we have appropriated it as self. We identify with it as mine, myself, my body, my pain, my dissatisfaction. But then when we look more closely, we begin to see what it is that he is trying to point out to us, which is that the aggregates are the bases of our experience. Physical form, yeah? Sensation, is it pleasant or unpleasant or neutral? When you stepped outside for walking meditation, was it 100% pleasant? Maybe. I just was like, joy. Perception, cognition, naming and identifying things. That goes on. Volitional formation, our mental habits. Consciousness, awareness of all the elements in the world. But experience is also absolute in itself. And the meaning of this is laid out in the questions of King Melinda. I don't know, maybe the people who were in Dalren are familiar with these, but this was an encounter that happened between a Greek king and a sage who lived several hundred years after the Buddha, and his name was Nagasena. So a monk, or the king, asked Nagasena, what do you mean by the absolute? And so Nagasena said, well, did you arrive in a chariot? And the king said, yeah, I did. He said, well, so what makes up a chariot? And the king says, well, you know, the frame, the axle, the wheels. And so he says, well, is the axle the chariot? And the king says, no. Well, is the framework the chariot? No. If you take away the yoke that holds the horse, is it still a chariot? How about the reins? So no part in isolation can be called a chariot. That's how he described the situation that we have with the aggregates. We are aggregated just the way a chariot at that time was aggregated, or a car. You take away the motor, you take away the distributor, you take away the axle. You don't got the car. It all is there, and when all of those conditions are gathered in just the right configuration, you have a vehicle that'll take you somewhere. And that's true of our body and our life. So it clearly exists in the sense that that here we are. But it has no inherent existence because you take away any portion and you don't got no chariot. Right? So chariot in this story was a really useful designation, but can't be said to truly exist in and of itself. And that's true of the self. Being aware of that, thoroughly aware of that, is a condition for freedom. And because then we are free to choose our behavior. Behavior that is kind, patient, helpful, accurate. So Dogen in his guidelines for studying the way said, is there a real basis for the notion of self inside or outside your body now? Your body with hair and skin is just inherited from your mother and father. From beginning to end, a drop of lymph or blood is empty of self-nature. So none of these are the self. What about the mind, thought, awareness, and knowledge? Or the breath going in and out, which ties a lifetime together? What is it after all? None of these are the self either. How can you be attached to any of them? That's one of the beauties of the practice in Zazen, of breathing in and breathing out. It is a simple, honest, respectful witness to the nature of our life. And it's really interesting when you practice with that very simple practice, how deeply relaxed you can become, where everything is all right. Even the problems that we face in this relative world, the problems never go away. Because the relative and the absolute are, we chant the identity of relative and absolute, they are always together. There's always the relative forms. It's just true. So this is the view. These are views, two truths. The relative truth, the relative view, and the absolute view. The relative, that although the self has no inherent existence, we are alive. We experience. This is the truth. This is the relative truth. One Chan master said it so clearly, what you find outside is not the treasure of your own home. I love that way of saying it. It's not the treasure, but we take care of everything as the treasure, as the conditions of our own home. And when you discover this treasure right here, always, you begin to respect yourself and your life deeply and completely. There's a profound shift when we realize our own life as the whole universe, everything in it. So what is the attitude that you bring toward your own self? And what needs clarifying in order to rest deeply in a self that you thoroughly respect? What work still needs to be done? And that work is the Buddha way. That's the way. And there's always more work because the relative world goes on. As long as this relative person does. And that's all we can know anyway. So thank you. I hope there was something in this that is useful. May we all awaken to our full life.